welcome to the rulebook portion of tonight's festivities. My name is Dusty, and I will be your guide to, we'll get to the title in a minute, but first I want to start with a little analogy. My friend Carl said, writing rules is like writing a computer program where there's a high probability any given line will be interpreted incorrectly. And it was really, I think, an astute observation. Once upon a time, I was a Java programmer, and the selling point for Java was supposed to be write once, run anywhere. But the running joke was write once, debug everywhere. And I think of writing a rule book similarly, that if you think of each individual person interpreting those rules, they all have their own OS, basically. They're going to interpret things differently. They're going to make their own unique mistakes. But hopefully, with some of the tips that I will give you today, you will be able to avoid some of these common errors. So this is Rulebook Pitfalls for Indie Designers, common errors and how to avoid them. So first of all, by way of introduction, how many of you consider yourselves indie designers? Probably 2/3 of the room, maybe more. I would define an indie designer as people who are either self-publishing, often through Kickstarter, or people who are designing for themselves and trying to get games published by mainstream publishers. Some people are just hobbyists who are just designing games for their own fun. And in that case, these rules are still interesting, but maybe not as important. For anybody who's sending their games to other people, you want your game to be played the way that you intended for it to be played. And it's vital that it is not only effective in communicating the rules, but also that it looks professional and polished. So who am I to be telling you stuff? I mentioned my name is Dusty. It's actually Dustin. Dustin Oakley, but I go by Dusty. And my main claim to experience in this field is that I work as a sanity tester for the Game Crafter. When people submit for testing their rules and shop pages, I'm one of the now 3 or 4 people who can do that task. And over the last 4 years, I've done over 160 such rule books that involves reading the rules and giving detailed feedback on a rubric on the topics that we're about to see. Sorry, my mouth is getting dry. So the outline of the presentation, here's what I'm going to be talking about today. The introduction. All right, we're almost a quarter of the way through the talk. Next, we'll go through the examples and of the biggest pitfalls and have some summaries of best practices. Note about the examples. They mostly come from games that are on TGC, and most of them were games that I was sanity testing. Since they're largely negative examples showing pitfalls, I chose to leave them anonymous so as not to make anybody feel bad. But you should also know that a lot of the people who had their sanity tests done took the feedback and subsequently improved their rules. So these are the old versions, not the new and improved versions. If I had been smarter and thought of this before just now, I could have taken rule books that people had updated and used those as an example, maybe next year. Oh, and I should also say, if you have any questions along the way, save them. No, raise your hand and let me know. So our biggest pitfalls I've broken down into 3 different categories. Rulebooks tend to be poorly organized, incomplete, and/or hard to read. And of these, the biggest thing that I see is usually disorganization. And again, I've broken that down into 3. Jay would be very pleased. The first of these is not following the standard outline. I would say that modern rulebooks have pretty much standardized on the order of presentation of rules to the most extent. And the easiest way to begin your rulebook creation is to start with what you have in this handout. It's the same thing basically that we went through last year's CrafterCon. That talk is available on YouTube, so I recommend that you check that out. I'm organizing things differently, hopefully to spur different parts of people's brains this time. And I won't go into as much detail on every section, but we will touch on most of these throughout the examples coming up. So the standard rulebook, again, as Jay has alluded to earlier, you're going to start out by setting the stage. So your thematic introduction corresponds to what he calls that narrative, introducing who you are, what you do, and how you win, or what your goals are. And then the overview / objective is going to set that mechanically. So this is a game that you are playing as a worker placement placer, whatever the example is of a mechanical introduction saying, or we're a team cooperating to try to wipe out the flu by getting all the cubes off the board, whatever your examples are. The next section will introduce the terminology and the physical aspects of the game. So you have the components and the setup. The components are a good place to start, as I say, introducing the terminology. This is what this is called, and you can even have some basics as far as what this is used for in the game. But as I'll show you in a future example, you don't want to get too far into it too deeply too soon, because that's where the gameplay section comes in, the heart of the matter. So you want to have your gameplay come out in play order and from general to specific. You always want to be laying out frameworks and then filling in the details. So I'll go into a little bit later complex ideas, and one of the key things is to be able to lay out the groundwork first and then give the details later once they have that basis of an understanding. And then supplementary material at the end. We'll talk about that a little bit as well. So as far as disorganization, some books just miss whole sections of these rules, which is obviously problematic. Unless you have something very abstract or very simple, in which case you could leave out the thematic introduction, or you might leave out the overview because your rules are only a page or two long. That's fine. But in general, you want to have the topics that we covered just a second ago. So in this case, we're missing context. And it's hard to express the full scope of missing context without having you read a whole rule book. But here are some short examples. First, this is the end of the setup section on page 3. And it tells you the player begins the game followed in a clockwise pattern. And then right after that, we have how to play. And it goes into the cards and the details of the specific advantages, as it says, that how each card is played without telling you the actions. So each player is allowed 3 actions per turn. Well, we're giving you all this detail up front without ever telling you what you're going to do on your turn or what the structure of the game is. So it's important when you start your gameplay section that you start out with a framework. You can also include part of that in your overview to lead readers naturally as you give them more detail. So as I said, the page 4 had all these 4 and 5 had all these details, but it didn't tell you what you're doing until page 6. Similarly with terminology, here's a rule book that has movement attack tokens, and you have to choose which side you're going to put it as. It stays that for the remainder of the game. It's asking you to make this potentially important decision. This is the first time that these have been mentioned other than in the component list where it just has the name. So on the next page, you see, oh, they're also worth 1 point if it's unused at the end of the game. It gives us a little bit more information. But it's not until page 7 that it tells you what it's actually used for, and that is it can be used before any roll of that type to add 1 to it. So I need to make this decision. How am I going to do this thing? But I don't find out until 2 pages later what that thing is or what that means. Another example is this from the game setup. Basically 3 pieces of terminology. You'll need AP, DP symbols, and something to keep up with your SP amount. So none of these terms these initials were not defined at any point before this. We have to go from page 1 to page 12. And then
from working in the computer industry, that happens a lot. People just start throwing terms at you, and you're like, I don't know what those mean.
yeah, and computer terminology is often riddled with TLAs, 3-letter acronyms. Okay. Yep. So then we find out that spirit points are gained or lost by a card effect. So, we're going to be tracking those probably on paper or with a die or something. So in summary, for missing context, and this is one of the forms of disorganization, define terms when they're first used. You don't necessarily have to define everything in the component list, but it's often nice to have a section after the components that introduces the terminology of the different pieces. Give background before specifics. So I'm going to be hammering on this idea that you're always giving context before details. Lay out the framework and then fill in the details. And provide rules as they are needed or forward reference. So I would have been fine with this last example if they had said attack points, spirit points, and then said see page 12. It would have been better. It still would have been nice to know about them a little bit sooner, but forward referencing can take care of some of your problems, because sometimes you feel like it's chicken and egg. I don't want to introduce rules too soon, but I don't want to leave them until late in the rule book. So another type of disorganization at a finer scale is misplaced rules. You'll see this one should look familiar. So again, this is a component. It was under the how to play section, but it's showing you the cards, and there were all the different card types, and it gives you the first sentence is a good sentence that you could use to describe a component in a general sense. Setback cards are used to slow down your opponents. Great. Stop there. The rest of this is rules that need to be in a form when the person needs to know how to play the game. So you're just giving the basic general overview of the rules. Sometimes you're going to use a diagram to show the different parts of the rules. So you want a card diagram that says, here's your mana cost, here's your hit points, things like that. Another example where we have a lot of rules in a component description. Again, the beginning of this is good. Material cards are a limited item within the game. This is meant to show over-harvesting of the land. And then it gives you the exact rules for how to do that, which we don't want at this point. Somebody reading this, they're going to read this now, and they're going to, in the component section, because if you look at your handout, the components are before even set up in gameplay, right? So they're going to be reading this in the component section and thinking, OK, this doesn't mean anything to me yet, and then have to come back to it later on when they get to that section of the rules that it talks about. Or the rules will have to be repeated. And one of the things you want to avoid is repeating your rules. So show diagrams of cards or components and give basic terminology, but do not give more detailed rules. Other misplaced rules in examples. This one is taking, it's got a concept of an attack rating that gets increased when you have a blacksmith. But it doesn't actually tell you how much it gets increased. You have to figure it out from the example. And then the last sentence in the example, the blacksmith has to be active to receive this benefit. That's another rule that's not actually written in the rules section, it's written in the example. So I prefer for examples to be set in a different typeface. Often use italics for examples because it's harder to read. People often will skip over them if they understand the rule just from reading the straight rule. And it's nice and gives a visual cue that this is something that you don't necessarily have to read. And if it's something you don't have to read, then you don't want to have any rules there. Examples are just to exemplify. Another example. This again, it uses the example and puts a rule right at the end. The yellow pawn and the blue pawn are on the same space. This is allowed. It didn't say anywhere else that they could occupy the same space, just within this example. Another thing to avoid, people are kind of trained to ignore or pay less attention to parentheses. So if you have a rule, don't put it inside parentheses. Make it its own sentence, standalone. Here you have maximum 10 cards per player. So there's a hand limit, but it doesn't come out and say the hand limit is 10 cards. That would be better. And beware of using italics for rules. This is actually from a published game, Outlive, which I think might be an indie publisher, so will give me half credit for that. But here you see they've added rules in the italics up above that give you more detail to the rule down below. It says, place your heroes on the board, and then up above, players may place their heroes on the board simultaneously or to add an element of strategy, place them one at a time according to turn order. I mean, if that's important, then you could have it on a call-out box next to that and say C to the right, or I don't know how you would do it, but having it in italics makes it seem optional, makes it seem like either theme or examples. So in summary, don't introduce new rules and examples, use dashes or commas rather than parentheses, or separate out rules that you have in parentheses, and then use bold or color for emphasis instead of italics when you're talking about rules. Our next main section is rules that are incomplete. And we have not 3 sections this time, unfortunately. A lot of games don't have the narrative and the mechanical introduction that Jay talked about. Some of them are missing the overview, the mechanical introduction. This one's ironic because it's titled Overview. But it is actually missing the overview in my terminology. It's all thematic introduction. There was no mechanical, this is a cooperative or competitive game. This is what you're going to be doing on a turn. The opposite of this is this brief overview started up the rule book, and there was no thematic introduction at all. So it was a one-on-one battle game like Magic, but there was no setting and no person introduction or anything. It was the kind of thing that there was no story being told. So these 2 sections, I know Jay already did a good job of kind of introducing this, but I'll go through it in my own take. The introduction is going to set the scene thematically, who you are, what you're doing, where, when, possibly, and most importantly, why. Why are we playing? What are we fighting over, or what's the goal? And then a call to action. It's nice if the end line of that paragraph is something exciting, like go storm the castle, or wait, no, have fun storming the castle. Thank you. It should not have rules or mechanics. Whereas the overview is kind of the opposite in that you don't want to have as much theme, you want it to be mechanical. So this is talking to the gamer and mostly the gamer type of his. I shouldn't talk about things I just learned because I don't remember them. So those are some things you can look at when you're writing your overview. There were exercises last year that talked about introductions and overviews and helping you write those. I'll put those out online as well, so you can add that handout to this one and have a whole slew of stuff. All right, incomplete setup. So we went through thematic introduction and overview and how those could be missing and what they're important for. Then we had component list is pretty obvious, and setup. We want to include all the details so that somebody reading this can set up your game. Your rules will be read aloud, and you want your rules to be understood by somebody who's just listening to them. So what that means is you need to give details. This says, deal every player 4 orange command cards. Lay out 4 blue number cards in a row, face up. So it's good they say face up. They have a picture that helps us know that they mean in a row, side to side. The problem with this is there's no shuffling. Do we just deal out the cards as they are? Do we sort the cards? This picture makes it look like we're doing cards in order, but the intent of the game later on, I realized, was that the blue number cards are actually also shuffled. So always be careful to make it very explicit that you need to do this in that manner. Another thing to watch for is that all your components in the component list are addressed in your setup. So again, with this movement attack token and score pad and pencil, even if it's just to say set these aside or set these near the board for players to reach or put them back in the box, you want people to know what to do with the stuff, because if they see things on the component list and they don't know what to do with it, that can be confusing. This one has several different aspects going on. First of all, again, shuffle the news, ICOs, tokens, and hardware cards. Are we shuffling them all together? So you want to have separate your cards as one of your steps if you do that. And then just place them on the game board, but it doesn't tell us where. And I don't think this one had a picture, I don't remember, but it's good to give explicit directions so that when somebody's talking, they can follow, the person listening can follow and complete the setup. The bottom part of this has start playing. Okay. Who starts playing? The end of setup for me always should have who the first player is. So this one I thought was fun too. It has, I didn't put an arrow on it, but gameplay and turn phases. So the end of setup, you're ready to battle, and then starting with the first. Okay, starting with the first player, but it didn't tell us who the first player is. So here's my setup summary. Remember, separate and shuffle cards. Are the components face up or face down, public, private, or hidden? Or if you deal out cards, does that mean that they're a hand that the person, I mean, you can use some shortcut terms like that. People aren't stupid, but sometimes cards are face down for a reason, or you want to keep them hidden. So make sure you're very specific. Same thing with locations. And then who's the first player? All right, and we skip the gameplay because, you know, that's not that important. And go down to the end game. Here's that objective is to vanquish all of your opponent's characters. This was, as I said, at the start of the rules. This was it. There was no other section. There was no other commentary on how to win the game. It was just this objective statement at the very beginning. So a lot of times I'll see rule books that don't have a end game section. And when you're referring to a rule book in the future, you're always going to look toward the back of the book to find the end game, because that's what seems natural. So make sure that you have an end game section near the end of the rules, and then always include exactly how the game ends, who's going to take how many more turns, not only what the trigger is, but some games will complete the round, some games will complete an additional round, dictate all the sources of points, obviously, but sometimes people will leave off things because they seem obvious, like they're VPs on cards or something like that, and they won't list them in the victory point list. And then, very importantly, how are ties resolved? So there's a story that the game of Agricola, if you tie at a game of Agricola, you play another game of Agricola, and the winner of that game is determined to be the winner of both. So we kind of want to avoid that, especially with 2 or 3 hour long games. So have tiebreakers. Now, I'm going to tell you something that Rado has to say, if you can hear it. Oh.
There is thematic reasoning behind the rules, but they never actually talk about theme in the manual. They just I think it's always a mistake when games write a manual and just make it a clear, easy to read, but very straightforward description of these are the rules. These are, you do X, then Y, then Z, and there's never any of the Y. They always leave the Y out, and that's so stupid. It would make rules so much easier. It's how I always teach.
You probably didn't hear it, but that was 30 seconds worth of.
Can you rerun it? Let's
Yep.
make where we can all hear it. Go ahead.
Well, a lot of games I notice there is thematic reasoning behind the rules, but they never actually talk about theme in the manual. They just I think it's always a mistake when games write a manual and just make it a clear, easy to read, but very straightforward description of these are the rules. These are, you do X, then Y, then Z, and there's never any of the Y. They always leave the Y out, and that's so stupid. It would make rules so much easier. It's how I always teach.
And in case you still couldn't hear it, there's a transcript. Of course, it might be too small for you to read, in which case, sorry. So basically, when there's a thematic reason for some mechanics in the book, it's useful to make a note of that. Rado is saying that basically having that thematic reasoning, when it ties in, makes your game tie together better, makes everything easier to understand, makes it easier to teach. One problem, though, is that you don't want to mix theme and mechanics into the same paragraph or the same section of rules without distinguishing them, because some people don't care about the theme. There are a lot of players who just skip over that whole aspect of the rule book, and if you have that mixed in with your rules, that's going to be annoying to them. So here's an example of that. This one is obviously published Game Galaxy Trucker. I don't know if you can see that, but if you find an abandoned ship, you're in gravy. There is some sort of protocol for reporting these things, but what the heck? Surely some of your crew are sick of you by now, and have been saving for a ship of their own. Fix up the abandoned ship and sell it to them for a fair price. So all that's by way of telling you what this mechanism is in their game, where you can discard a number of figures and basically get money for your ship. I think that's how that works. I didn't read it. Anyway, speaking of which, sometimes rules are hard to read. To be fair, this is a very early set of rules to chess written in Latin. So this is our last major pitfall. Remember, as I just said, that your rules will be read aloud. It is vital that they be clear. So rules can be written unclearly in a whole bunch of ways. And you might think some of this is getting into nitpicky grammar police kind of stuff, and some of it does. But remember, when people are looking at your rules, especially if it's self-published, it's going to be something that people will pick up on. If there are spelling errors or even just missing commas and apostrophes, a lot of gamers, believe it or not, are kind of nitpicky people, and they might notice those things. So voice is the term that I'm using for the tense and the person that you use in writing. Some of this is actually done quite well now, for the most part. I only found a few examples in the rule books that I looked at that had errors. Basically, you want to give things as commands whenever you can. So this says 5 cards are drawn at the start of the game. Pop quiz. How can I reword that so that is a command?
Draw 5 cards.
Draw 5 cards at the start of the game. How about all the tokens need to have their stickers put on?
Put the stickers on the tokens.
Yep. I first did it, you must put stickers on all the tokens, which is a little less direct than apply stickers to all the tokens. So no matter how concise you make it, you can always make it more concise. The difficult part is finding that fine line between conciseness and opaqueness, I guess. So I have a positive example. As I said, this has been pretty good lately. This uses the command form, place the table on the board, or yeah, taste the playable, the pestle with the vessel is the, shuffle the deck of the cards and place them on the board. Then they're inspired to use each player because it's not just you. So when you have to when you default to the command form, but sometimes you have to go back to each player. Each player picks a colored pawn. Each player rolls a 6-sided die. And then sometimes all players makes more sense. So all players have to place their pawns on the witch's start location. So in summary, what I just said. And passive statements should be avoided. Oh, nobody groaned. So using commands can make writing succinct and efficient, as I said, but there are other cases where the writing can get repetitive or overly wordy. Some examples, they have headers for a reason. You don't have to repeat what the header just said. What is included with this game? In this box you'll find starting the game, at the start of the game, deciding who goes first, to decide who goes first. It just becomes really redundant and kind of boring to read. This one I think is great. In a 2 to 4 player game or blank is a 2 to 4 player game that takes between 20 to 60 minutes to play. A big part of the game is learning how to play. These instructions will cover all the basics, but if you prefer to watch videos rather than to read, you can find all the basics covered at YouTube. Or they could do this. Here we have some repetition of rules. So your turn, it's great that they split this out as your turn as the scaffolding telling you what you're going to be doing, and then they have the rules. Unfortunately, in this case, they could have simplified and just made everything together because you have choose if you are rolling for material or attacking someone, if you are rolling for material or attacking another player. The only thing added there is that you have to say it verbally. And then you cannot attack someone until round 3 has started. 2 rounds must pass before attacking another player becomes an option. And this, I didn't move these around. This is the layout that was in the book. It was one thing right above the other. So when I reworked this example, it got quite a bit shorter. I just added verbally onto the first thing. I added some bolding to identify the options that you have available, and then I gave it an A and a B to make it clear that those were options. And then those rules down below are bullet points, just as he had them. So there. In summary, avoid repeating rules. Eliminate extra words. Another problem some writers have is using jargon that the reader might not be familiar with. So it all depends on the audience of your game. If you're gearing a game toward gamers, or if you're writing an RPG, you can pretty well assume that they know the D nomenclature for dice. If it's a family game or something that you're going to show your grandmother, she might not be familiar with that. So we would want to obviously replace that D10 and D6 with the 10-sided die and the 6-sided die. I forgot to quiz you guys on this one. So this one is a little bit more borderline. They did a good job in the first place of defining melds. They put it in parentheses, which I think is okay, as sets and runs. I would have actually made it even more clear, because if you're not a rummy player or a card game aficionado, you might not know sets means that it's the same number and runs are sequential numbers. So just adding those few words makes it a lot more clear and eliminates any of the ambiguity that anybody who doesn't know these things is then able to understand. So back to our favorite attack movement token example. You probably didn't notice in that other page, but it actually lists them as two different orders. So first it's an attack movement token, and then it's a movement attack token. Highlights that you always want to be consistent in your naming. And this applies not only to the name itself, but also to the capitalization, and even if you're going to bold things or put them in a different color. I've seen some good rule books that they have key terminology color coded. It's hard to, or it's kind of a pain to do, but it makes it easy to spot when you're coming up to a game key term. So define potentially confusing information or terminology, and then explain things the first time they're used. Be consistent. In your handout, there is this terminology exercise. It's on the back of the second page. So when you get home or later tonight at your hotel, if you want to pull out one of your rule books and go through this, look for the first instance of each of your terms that you use in the game. So if you're defining a spaceship as, you know, this small component or whatever, write it down on the gray part, and then quiz yourself. Is it defined when you're first using it? You can give yourself some slack with the component list. You don't have to define things right away, but then subsequent to that, when you're using it, put a check mark in A, and are the rules for the term given only as needed? So that's checking to make sure that it's not all in the component list, that you're giving rules as they're required. And then the term is used consistently in format and in name throughout the rules. So yes, ma'am.
Do you think we should define things like rounds, phases, terms in our rules? Or do you think they're general enough?
That's a good question. Oh, the question was, should you define things like rounds and turns in your rule book? I would say that it's become pretty standard that a turn is a single person and the round is the table around the table. And as long as you use it in those ways, you don't necessarily have to you don't have to define them. But some games have ages or phases where it's like you go around the table 5 times, and then, or you go through fall and winter, and then it triggers this thing. In those cases, I would like to have names for those things, and some games don't do that, and I find it kind of annoying. You know, like call it a year or call it a whatever, an age, but give us a name for it, because round is, there's another layer above round that a lot of times people don't have a name for, I guess. So the short answer was no. All right, I know a lot of people will roll their eyes because we're going to talk about grammar. As I've said, though, it's going to make your rules look unprofessional and, in some cases, harder to read. So it's still something to pay attention to. Punctuation. I liked this quotation, so I'm going to read it. Most punctuation's role is semantic, to add precision and complexity to meaning. It increases the information potential of strings of words. So basically, a lot of people think, oh, a comma is just there to say you're pausing for breath or something like that. but actually punctuation serves distinct purposes in adding information to otherwise plain text. And you can see that in the examples that we have here. So for possessives, you probably know that something belongs to someone. Depending on where the apostrophe is, it means different things. So when you specify both players, you have two people, where's the apostrophe going to go? After the S. When you have one player's turn, it's going to go before the S. So just that little bit, if I didn't say after the player's turn, instead of a player, I should have made this as a slide too, note to self for next year. I should have said, or I could have said at the end of the player's turn, or turns. If I had the there, and I put the apostrophe S, I know it's one person. If I put the S apostrophe, I know it's many people, more than one person. So it's a meaningful bit of information just for the placement of that apostrophe. I see those two sentences, by the way, were from rule books. I see that all the time, that people don't put an apostrophe in players. I don't know why. So don't do it. It makes me mad. All right. It's my favorite. Ugh. This was interesting because I have an example of both of them. Usually you see the first case where people use the apostrophe in the possessive, but somebody did the opposite as well in leaving off the apostrophe when they're meaning it is. So as you probably know, but I'm going to drum it into your head, it's is possessive, it's is it is. See, without the punctuation, it's not as meaningful. Yes?
Quick aside, how do you feel about contractions in general?
The question is, how do you feel about contractions in general? I think it depends on the tone that you're going for. So in most rule books, I think it's fine to use contractions. I would say that if you're going for something that sounds especially academic or, I don't know, in some cases, it could be more clear by spelling out do not instead of don't. You can bold the word not in where you can't really bold the N apostrophe T and make that stand out in your rules.
I also do wonder, I do a lot of other work in international communities, and I do wonder if non-native English speakers struggle with contractions. So I try to avoid it, but I was just wondering if there was a general standard.
That's interesting. He said internationally, a lot of people can struggle. Non-native English speakers can struggle with contractions, and that makes sense. But I think the key here that everybody can note right now and then never mess this up again, so I'll go on Facebook and I'll never see an it apostrophe S possessive. Think of ours or hers or theirs or his even. There's no apostrophe. Those are all possessive pronouns. So is its. It is, think of theirs or that's. It is. Obviously, most people get that correct. My next little nitpick is there's a comma in an if statement. So when I read this aloud, if a player is sent here, their turn ends immediately. Now you can parse what I said, but when I say if the player is sent here, there, the comma goes where the then would be. So if the player is sent here, comma, their turn ends immediately. Just another thing that I see a lot. I have keyboard shortcuts set up on my computer, and I have one that if I type IFQQ, it types in a sentence with an if, you should put a comma where the then should be, because that's how commonly I see it. So here's a great one. People don't really mess this up, but I thought it was funny. So Rachel Ray finds inspiration in cooking her family and her dog. So commas can save the lives of pets and families. This one, it doesn't bug me too much because I know it's tricky, but the name of the section should probably be set up with no space. It's the noun. I'm doing the setup. I'm setting up the game. If you think about the space in the verb, I'm setting up the game, right? So you have to put a space between setting and up. If I am not setting up the game, but I set up the game, it still needs a space. The hyphenation is a little trickier, and I let people slide, even myself, because, you know, hyphens are weird. Speaking of non-native speakers, if you can see this, I won't read it aloud, but try to read it to yourself. Do you think you'd be able to figure out how to play it? You probably could, but you realize if you got this as a Kickstarter and these were the rules, I don't think you would back that person's next Kickstarter. So there's always somebody who knows more than you about written language. Take advantage of that fact and use them. I have business cards. I'm not saying that I know everything. There's always someone who knows more than you, including me. Knows more than me. So tips on this. Jay had mentioned using a word processor, spelling, and grammar check. Please do. How many, let's take a poll. Do you use Word for writing rule books? Pretty good portion of people. How many of you use InDesign? A few people. And how many type right into a paint program, Photoshop, or something like that when they're doing cards and stuff? Nobody will admit it? Thank you. One person admitted it. Yay. So I'm going to go into some tools and tips in a second, and we'll get into some more specific items for those different options. But the important thing is, yeah, you want to be able to have a spell checker, and grammar checking is great too. So aside from the writing style, the appearance of the rules can help or hinder the reading and the understanding. Even if you follow a good structure, it's easy to get lost in the rule book if you don't have good hierarchy. So I'll get to that in a second. Never mind. In this case, the character sheet is a bigger topic. The traits of being is like the statistics in this system. So that's a smaller thing, but they look exactly the same. If I'm flipping through the book and I'm trying to find traits of being, and I see character sheet and I see traits of being, it's much less intuitive to find what I'm looking for. Then skills are another topic. Skill attempts are a subtopic of that, so that should be smaller. They did a good job in making a different color, so at least it distinguishes it. But always use font size. Sometimes font face and color are great ways to distinguish your hierarchy and make sure that it's at the right level. Here's another example where everything is at the same level, even though conflicting property cards is a subcategory of drawing a property card. Drawing a property card is a subproperty of, or whatever, subsection of during a player's turn. They did do a good job in laying out the 1 and the 2 on the player's turn, so kudos for that. My favorite positive example for this, I'll repeat, is from Small World, and they do everything right. They have starting the game, it's big, it's brown, or I don't know what color that is. I don't have a big color vocabulary. Then the first turn is a little bit smaller. It's numbered, or actually Roman numeraled. Picking a race, expanding through new conquests are smaller. They're subcategories, and they use, or that one at least uses a number. And then the subcategory is small, different color again. And they even get bonus points because when they have a list of things that you do in order, they use bullet points that have numbers. And then when they have a list of things that are options, they're just using bullet points with a big or in the middle. The other thing that I'd say you can use is A or B, which is usually means that you have choices. So I've said all of this, but it's the summary. Ensure that the similar levels are formatted similarly. Again, a published game, Castles of Mad King Ludwig. You in the back, can you read that? Not you with the young eyes, you with the... So, yeah, the background can be a little bit distracting. Sometimes it makes the game actually harder to play just because you're trying to decode. It's like that thing that JT showed this morning with the red text overlaying everything, trying to decode the text. So there's another game that has a similar theme to its background, but they made the intelligent decision to put this white layer over the bright yellow bricks, so at least you can see the text that's on top of it. All right, we're zooming out. We're going into C next. Are there any questions at this point? Yes, sir.
What would be some examples of well-known games that have good rulebooks?
I particularly like some of the Stefan Feld games. I think Aaliyah does them, if that's how you say that, publisher. One of the things I like about them is they have a running main text, and then they have sidebars that have summaries, so that if you're just refreshing yourself on the rules, it's just very, it's not even full paragraphs, they're just like sentences or fragments telling you things. I can give you some examples of bad rules that I've encountered recently. The worst rule books are either disorganized, where you're reading about something and you have a question about how that rule plays out, and then you don't find out until 2 pages later or 5 pages later. That was the case with Carson City. There were rules spread around the rule book. Another one was Planet Steam, I just played the other day, and it had just, it was one of those where the whole game summary, the game end summary was at the beginning. So we're like, okay, how does the game end? I don't know. And then you keep going, oh, it's in the overview or the objective page. In general, I find rule books have gotten a lot better. But yeah, I think a good thing to do is to take a game that's similar to your own and find a rule book for it and use that as kind of the basis. And you can determine for yourself if you think it's a good rule book, then just kind of borrow their ideas. If it's a bad rule book, then you can make corrections. And either way, you're seeing a lot, you're getting a lot of good information. So I didn't really answer your question, but I avoided it pretty deftly. So the opposite of the bad rule books are the good rule books, which are organized, complete, and easy to read. Here are some tools and tricks. And hopefully, some of these are pretty specific, so they might not apply to everybody. But if they apply to a couple people, I hope that will be useful. So I mentioned using a word processor. A great way to stay organized is to use styles in a word processing program. InDesign has, what do you call InDesign? A publishing program? A page layout program? Something like that?
Yeah, it's like a spread. It's good for like magazines.
Yeah. Desktop publishing, thank you. That's the term from the olden days. So yeah, all those tools, Word and Pages and Google Docs, all have, is that what that's called now? Google Docs? Okay. Anyway, they all have styles that you can use to set up. And what you want to do is you want to have your headers, your title, your subtitles, your subheadings, define each of those in a separate style. And there are a couple of reasons for doing this. First of all, it'll automatically make the nesting look nice. And secondly, if you decide to change things, if you are actually going to be publishing from this document, you just go into one place, you redefine like the heading 1, and you change the font, or you change the bolding, and then you update the style, and it applies it throughout the document. The other reason, here's InDesigns. The other reason to do that is this works great for word process documents, even if you're not going to be publishing. From it, you can use it to check your outline, basically to form your table of contents. So in Microsoft Word, you go to View and Outline, and then it gives you this list where right now it's at level 1, and that's all your top level styles. And then if you have indented styles, it'll go out to level 2. So in the top middle, it's changed to showing level 2. And you can do that to make a layout, or basically a table of contents, and make sure that your rules are all formatted well. Google Docs says the same thing. It's just called Document Outline. That's in the Tools menu, unless it's changed, which hopefully it has not. And then InDesign has a cool feature. If you know InDesign and you're using it, you probably already know this, but it can actually generate a table of contents that gives you page numbers, and you can format it to your heart's content. And then the other exercise in your booklet here is the outlining exercise. So if I have an example rule book and I want to copy down the headers, indenting as it makes sense. So it'll basically give you a similar way to accomplish that if you're not using styles or a word processor, just to test yourself and make sure that you're, the questions below you can read, hopefully. Basically making sure that they all follow the outline and that they are headers of the same level are formatted the same way. All right, on to making your rules complete. One way to make sure that your rules are complete is have people who are not familiar with the game read the rules. Just ask them, do you think you could play this from what you just read? It's best to include a variety of different people. So take a non-gamer and have them read your rules and say what was confusing to you. Take an avid gamer and read your rules, and you will get different answers, obviously, but all of the answers should be meaningful and helpful. Record yourself teaching the game. Next time you do a playtest, just set up your voice recorder and teach the game as you normally do. When you get home, play it back and look at your rules as you're going through. Was there anything that I missed in my rule book that I'm actually saying when I'm teaching the game? Were there questions that people were asking? Maybe in the rules you need an example or a picture for the things that people were asking questions about, which leads us to noting questions that playtesters ask. So even if you're not recording that particular session, either during the playtest or at the end of the playtest, what things were they asking about, what things were most confusing to them. And then obviously the most important thing you can do is blind playtest. Get it? Because they're blind and they're playing. It's really the best way to see that your rules are all there and can be understood in the right way. So did somebody talk about blind playtesting today? Basically, There are a couple different ways you can do it. The easiest way is you find a group of volunteers and give them your rule book and give them your game and say, go, I'm going to be here, but I'm not really here. So you can't answer questions for them. You let them figure it out for themselves and play the game. Sometimes you'll see that they don't play the game the way that you intended. Sometimes they'll argue over questions or debate what the reading of a particular rule is. And those are great pieces of feedback that you can use to then update your rule book. The other way is actually to send it off blindly and not be there, obviously. And when you do that kind of play test, you'll want to have some kind of feedback form that you're giving them so that you're sure that you're getting the best results of these are the questions that people had, these are the things that seemed unclear. And ideally, they might even be willing to record video their play so that you can actually watch it. So on the back pages of your handout, there's a bunch of URLs, which you might or might not be able to read, and QR codes. Trick for people who might want to do this in the future. On Google Sheets, there's a function that you can use to generate a QR code from a URL. So that's how I did this fanciness. It's pretty cool. Yeah. For reals. So most of these are on your list. Actually, I think all of them are on your list, other than maybe Reddit. I don't remember. But there are also a bunch of other rulebook essays and some videos and a podcast that if you didn't like me, I don't blame you. You can listen to other people or read about other people telling you how to do this. Alrighty. And that was not the end. Ha, fooled you. There's the whole easy to read section. So tools and tricks, easy for you to say. Tools and tricks for making your rulebook easy to read. They're going to be read aloud. So while you can do this yourself and check for places that you stumble, which for me would be often, it can be easier to listen to someone else read it. So enlist your friends to read your rulebook aloud. If you don't have any friends, how many of you have access to a Mac? Not that many people. How many of you have access to, I'll tell you, 2 people. You can highlight text, right-click it, and choose speak. It'll read to you in a fancy computer voice. In iOS, if you have an iPhone or iPad, you can turn on this in accessibility, which is speak selection, and it will enable this pop-up whenever you highlight text to speak it. So if you can get your text into that device, then you can have it read it to you. Sometimes it's fun for, bedtime, can't sleep, listen to your rule book. This one applies to anyone, even people who don't use Apple products, which seems to be most of the people in the room. ttsreader.com. This is really neat because you can just drag and drop a PDF onto this page, and then you choose from like 20 different, a drop down of like 20 different voices. They have all different accents and languages and stuff. So that one's great. The quality of the voices maybe isn't as good as the Apple ones, but it's still cool. An easy automated way to ensure your book is easy to read is readability calculation. This is in your list of references. The TT reader one is not, so TTS reader, sorry. I found that late, so that's not in your list if you want to write that one down. So for reading teachers and people doing mostly elementary reading instruction, they have all these different formulas for calculating the reading level of texts. And there are calculators online that will run your text through all these different things and give you grade level equivalents. Excuse me. I found a graphic that said, I don't remember now, some high number of people in the US are illiterate, basically. And I didn't put that in here because it was depressing and because probably gamers are not within that group for the most part. But nonetheless, the easier your book is to read, for the most part, the better. Shooting for like a 7th grade level is not out of the question. And that's what these numbers indicate. Then with this tool, you can expand a bunch of word statistics. It'll show you pardon. It'll show you the most common words, the repeated words. Some of them give you a number of multisyllabic words. So that can be interesting. Word actually has a similar thing built in, so you have to enable it. Here's the Mac version, which nobody cares about. You turn on Show Readability Statistics. In the Windows version, you turn on Show Readability Statistics, but it's in a different place. It's under proofing and when correcting spelling and grammar in Word. So what will happen then is as you run the spelling and grammar checker and you finish it, oh, there's one more thing to enable while you're at it. If you go to settings for this writing style, turn on the passive voice checker. That'll look for those nasty passive sentences that might have snuck into your rule book. And then once you finish your grammar checker, it gives you this. So as you're doing the grammar and spelling checker, it will highlight passive sentences. And then when you finish it, it tells you your percentage of passive sentences. It also gives you the readability scores and then these statistics, which can be interesting. All right. So regardless of how well you write, sometimes the information in your rule books is just very complex. And this is a little 5-step tool for trying to simplify or convey information in a simpler manner. Step 1 is pretend you're the president and try to distill your ideas into 140 characters. This is the old Twitter test before they expanded their characters to 280. Show and tell. We've talked about this in some cases, but obviously examples and diagrams are great, depending on how much room you have in your rule book and your budget for getting somebody to put it together if you're not capable in that regard. And then provide context. So I keep reiterating this. Give the framework before you give the details. That makes it easier to acquire the new information. Ensure coherency. So again, if your rulebook calls it a ship one time and a spaceship the next time, that's not good. You want it to be coherent. You want it to be the same. You want even the, well, we've talked about the headers and things like that to all be the same. And the last one is to segment. So if you have these complex sentences or paragraphs, you can break them down, split them up, separate things by headers or bullet points. I have an example of my attempt to do this. So these rules are not too bad, but they're a little bit hard to internalize when you read them as one big paragraph with a little footer. So starting with the player to the left of the player who placed the hole, the players take turns flicking hazards onto the field until there are 2 of each hazard on the field. Flick is tossing a card, keeping your hand on the table. I took basically the same words, but I segmented it. So I broke it down into 3 steps, which are numbered. That makes it easier when you're scanning through the book, or even when you're just reading it for the first time, to internalize it. And I incorporated the flicking rule into the step 2 so that you don't have to break where you're reading and go down to the bottom of the page and go back up. And that's about all I did, but I think it makes it a lot clearer. Sometimes there are things that are seemingly complex. So these are the rules for customizing a deck in the customizable deck game that I read the rule book for. And basically, they repeat stuff a lot. And there's an example spread into the middle there. This is the same information. So eliminate duplicates and, putting stuff into a format that is easy to read in short sentences. The examples down below in italics. As far as the layout of your rule book and the look of it, there's a crash course in graphics design for game designers from last year's CrafterCon. That's on YouTube. It was a good session, so I recommend that you watch that. I won't play it for you because you won't hear it anyway. All right, so I'm going to return to the analogy that we started with. So hopefully, in following these tips and tricks, your interpreters, who are your readers, will do the best job. You will not have them being crashing or having bugs. So there you go. Do that. Any questions? Yes?
What does it typically cost to have someone review your book? So if I send you my book, is it $5 or how does that work?
$30 to $40 for a review and feedback of, that was the question, how much does it cost? On the Game Crafter, I think they're still $30 for a sanity test, and then I do a similar service with a little bit more detail, and I'm charging $40 because I'm worth it.
Even if the book's 100 pages?
Then we'll have to talk. Well, actually, there was somebody who submitted an RPG that was probably 50 pages, and we still did the sanity test, but it was like, here's a subsection, like talked about the overall structure, and then took a subsection and gave some more specific feedback on that.
Do you also edit rule books, or do you just give feedback?
I do some editing as well. I think of myself as more of a Siskel than a Spielberg. That's Siskel and Ebert. They were movie reviewers. So I write rules, and I prefer to take people's rules and make them better. So yeah, I like editing and rewriting things better than I like writing them from scratch, I guess. If that answers the question.
But you do it as a service that you charge for?
Yes, I even have business cards. Not that I'm selling my service. I forgot to bring them out last year, so. Anything else? We have 7 minutes until lunchtime. Yes?
Do you, when reading rule books, if you're including numbers, do you ever spell them out, or do you just put the number in there?
I've come to the standard of just writing the numerals, except for rare cases like one player or 2 players. I would write out the numbers, the words. But when you're talking about quantities of cards or actions or things like that, I always just use the numeral because it's easier to see. Because a lot of times you're going to be scanning back through the rules. Okay, how many times can I do this action? Oh, there's the number. It's easier than finding the word in the mixture of text. Yeah.
So gameplay, finding the rules in that, but Endgame,
Yes.
there might be a trigger, but sometimes you have different rules during the end game.
True.
Put rules under the end game heading, or include it like a first phase and a second phase.
So the question is about endgame. We have endgame trigger on the outline, but sometimes the endgame can be a little different rules-wise. I would make, so that's one of the things I struggle with is, do you put the endgame trigger in the rules, do you put it in the endgame section, or do you put it in both? And it depends for me on how far apart they are. Sometimes you have some appendix type information in between, or more details in between the turn structure and the endgame section itself. But if the rules are different on the last turn of the last round, spoiled that, I would make that its own section at the beginning of the endgame. So you have the trigger usually in the main rule flow. So when somebody gets to 20 points, the endgame is entered, see the endgame, and then, or you could even preview what the endgame situation is going to be. Does that make sense? I didn't really answer your question. That's the look I'm getting.
It's fine.
Maybe we can talk after and I can understand better. Yes, sir.
Oxford, comma, yes or no?
Oxford, comma, yes.
You know, there was a lawsuit that was won for millions of dollars based on the Oxford comma. No, seriously. Or law, depending on what, or lack thereof.
Yes.
Millions, possibly millions.
Just with the apostrophe thing, my
Mhm.
understanding too is like if you're talking about the possessive of a name that ends in an S, you put it after still, even though it's a single, right?
Do you put an apostrophe S after a name that ends in S? And the answer is yes, although it's allowed either way. So the thing that bugged me is when I'm going to sound like a real Apple fanboy, but the iPhone 4S came out, and it would be written 4 capital S apostrophe, like the 4 S's screen, and it just looked ridiculous to me because people didn't put the S, the small s after the apostrophe.
So your preference is an apostrophe and another S.
Yes.
For someone's name that ends in S, even though apparently technically both are right.
Right. Yeah, my niece's name is Tess, T-E-S-S, and I write T-E-S-S apostrophe S, which is a little crazy, but it's consistent in my brain. The exception to that is Jesus, apparently by convention, does not have the S after the apostrophe. Word to the wise. All right, go eat.